Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Risk with Dr. Naveen Agarwal. Each week, we talk about a topic related to risk management of medical devices in a very casual and informal way. This is not a webinar or lecture. Rather, our goal is to talk about key topics and challenges in a very informal way and share best practices. I'm your host, Naveen Agarwal, and I'm the principal and founder at Achieve, where my personal mission is to help you achieve success in risk management. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our weekly Let's Talk Risk conversation. Super excited to see all of you here. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And guys, today we're going to talk about IVDs, how they are so much technology, especially software-based IVDs now coming into the marketplace, new risk topics and new risk considerations, new regulatory approaches, including the LDT. So this is going to be the scope of our conversation today, and I'm really excited to welcome my guest, Megan Kane, today. Megan, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you, Dr. Naveen.
Great, Megan. So let's start by introducing yourself to the audience. Would you mind sharing your story a little bit and what you're doing right now?
Of course. So as you said, I'm Megan Kane, and I'm currently the Director of Regulatory Operations at Valsera. I've held several different regulatory and quality roles throughout my career, both in very large and in very small medical device and IVD companies, with the majority of those being software-based devices. I'm also a regulatory advisor for medical device startups because I just genuinely love sharing the regulatory knowledge that I can and hopefully help to get new devices out in the world and reach patients sooner.
Exciting. So, Megan, I think the world of IVDs is changing rapidly, right? You mentioned software is now playing a very big role. So can you start by sharing just an example of an IVD or what's going on in the IVD world today using software?
Absolutely. I mean, the majority of IVDs these days involve some level of software. It's taking the world by storm. It's unavoidable, essentially. I currently work in next generation sequencing IVDs, which, to oversimplify it, they take DNA sequences or other RNA sequences from patients and convert them into digital data using different software analysis programs. And this data can then be used to identify cancer mutations or other clinical decisions within the patient's genes. And then that can further be taken to suggest clinical decisions based on a specific genetic profile so that we have really customized medicine for each patient.
Wow, that is really fascinating. So they can be used for detection. Can they also be used for maybe managing the disease state? Is that possible using NGS?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow. So, well, I can imagine that some very powerful technology behind the scene and, very complicated software. So, Megan, let's talk about some of the, very specific or special risk-related issues that, practitioners in our community should be aware of.
Yeah, when it comes to software used within an IVD, there are a lot of extra considerations that need to be taken into account. For example, cybersecurity is one that's talked about very frequently, and we also have patient data privacy and integrity, confidentiality, availability, just to name a few. One thing that comes up with software that I see too is that software will always have bugs, just by definition, which is unique to other types of devices who hopefully don't have the same number of issues. So you need to be able to have a really robust risk management procedure to ensure that you can differentiate bugs that are expected and standard and bugs that have risk impact.
Great. So guys, if you're just joining, my guest today is Megan Kane, and we are talking about IVDs and how software is playing a big role and how new risk topics are emerging in the IVD space. So Megan, I know we are definitely aware of the typical risk issues, right? Incorrect diagnostics or inaccurate or not timely available. And all those kind of topics are already quite difficult in terms of estimating and evaluating the risk to patients and users, because IVDs are sort of indirectly related to that. Now we are introducing software-based risks too. So can you say a little bit more about maybe some of the risk topics that you have come across? You mentioned cybersecurity and patient privacy, but anything else that jumps at you?
Yeah, I mean, Like you said, cybersecurity, for example, gets talked about quite a lot generally, but it can be difficult to connect that to the actual patient impact. We think about these malicious users, but what does that actually mean to patients when it comes to diagnostic tests? So often I see a mismatch there of connecting those two ends of the spectrum. If we want to walk through an example, if you had some sort of cybersecurity issue and it caused inaccurate test results in your diagnostic test, this can actually cause pretty severe patient harm. I often see that underrepresented. So imagine a patient is told that they are negative for some diagnostic test, and then they don't pursue treatment as a result. That can have terrible effects.
Yeah, especially when it comes to, let's say, cancer detection and those applications. Now, funny you mentioned severity, and I'm personally aware of at least one FDA warning letter to a very large manufacturer of IVDs where they specifically cited them for underestimating severities. So I'm sensing that FDA is becoming more and more involved and active and paying attention to where IVDs are going. And my gut tells me that it's because the technology is becoming so sophisticated.
Definitely.
Yeah. So let's jump to that now. What's happening in the regulatory world related to IVDs? What's new? And can you say a little bit more about some of the recent changes?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been a massive shift in the overall regulatory framework in diagnostic, not so much for traditional IVD manufacturers, but for laboratory developed tests. So recently the FDA announced a final rule that says that these LDTs are going to be regulated in the same way as standard IVDs. So that's a noticeable change for the way that they need to have oversight. It's a big shift for labs, both in terms of the expertise that they need and the financial burden that's needed as well.
Mm-hmm. So in what way? Can you say a little bit more about what is changing as far as the lab is concerned?
Sure. So nowadays, LDTs are going to need to follow the same regulations, the FDA regulations that IVD manufacturers are expected to comply with currently.
And that's, my understanding, again, not being a regulatory expert here, is just the regulatory approval or clearance process through 510K or PMA and the post-approval, post-marketing, like quality system regulation compliance. Is that what you are saying here?
Correct. Yeah. The quality management system regulations and the pre-market review requirements.
And currently that's not being done in the labs. Is that right?
Correct. Currently, the FDA exercises enforcement discretion, meaning that they don't need to enforce these rules on LDTs.
But I want to also make sure that we understand that it's not that labs are running wild. Like there is enough proper controls and there is a lot of supervision and activity, because these are, definitely complicated devices, but they're working across, in general, they're working and they're producing good results and advancing the practice of medicine. So it's not like they're out of control. It's like now they have new requirements that they need to comply. Is that a good way of positioning the change?
Definitely. And that explains why this change has been such a controversial topic, because these labs are already being overseen by CLIA, and now they're being asked to have duplicate oversight by the FDA as well. And so there's a lot of discussion around whether this is delaying innovation, whether it's affecting patients by not being able to get them the tests that they need. So there's many conversations happening here, but what the FDA is ultimately saying is that it shouldn't matter the location of where a test is being made. They don't care whether it's in a standalone remote hospital lab or whether it's coming from a giant corporate manufacturing facility or any of the gray in between those two extremes. The FDA is saying that at the end of the day, what matters most is that patients are getting consistent, safe, and accurate diagnostic tests. And in order to do that, everyone needs to be held accountable to the same set of criteria.
Great. So one thing I can think of is that, we are very careful about and diligent about applying risk management, both pre-market and post-market in the medical device world. We talk about ISO 14971 all the time. Will the same shift happen now in the IVD space, in the laboratory environment, where maybe they're not as diligent about that? Do you see that as becoming more of a routine expectation from FDA?
Absolutely. So these LDTs will need to meet those exact same regulations and ISO standards. And currently, there is some risk elements in CLIA certification and CAP accreditation, but it's not to the level that we're used to seeing in the IVD world. So It's not meeting those ISO 14971 requirements. And these LDT laboratories will need to come up to that level of compliance.
Okay, maybe that could be one of the concerns as they plan their transition through this new regulatory landscape to acquire new skills, to acquire new competencies and new procedures and methods, right? So maybe they are thinking it could be a pretty steep hill to climb. Wow, great. I think we have set the stage beautifully, Megan, for our conversation with our audience today. So guys, I'm going to start inviting you to participate in this discussion. And again, I know many of you are not in the IVD space, but I know you are very familiar with risk management and perhaps might be curious about how it might apply to IVDs or what new considerations might be important here. And maybe you have something to share from your perspective. So don't hold back. It doesn't have to be a question. It can be just a perspective or insight from your personal experience or anything you are curious about. Let's just have a very open discussion about this. So, Megan, while we are waiting for people in the audience to join us here, let's continue our discussion here. In your world, like you mentioned that you have recently changed your roles to a different organization. Can you say a little bit more about the differences between the work you do now versus what you have done in the past when it comes to software development or software-related issues?
Sure. So the company I'm with now is exclusively software. So it allows us to really focus deeply into those software regulations. The company I came from previously was the device manufacturer themselves. So we had hardware elements, software, and the lab work as well. So it was a much broader scope of the types of processes that we were developing. So I definitely understand the complexity when it comes to IVDs or LDTs and trying to understand how to apply these regulations and these requirements like risk management to very different types of processes, because the way that hardware is developed and the way that software is developed is wildly different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So right now, the work you are doing, are you actually developing IVDs or are you developing software for other IVD developers to use?
We are developing software that is a component within the overall IVD.
Oh, great. So your focus is quite exclusively on software risk management, but you're also thinking about how it's going to integrate with the rest of the system.
Definitely.
Interesting. So guys, again, floor is open. Please join us if you are curious about this topic or you have something to share. Don't hold back. Again, I'm sure you have some interesting perspective to share. So Megan, we're going to continue as we wait for folks to join us. Tell us a little bit more about, if you can share some details about in your world, when you are looking at software risk, how would you even think about estimating severity, even though you are a little bit removed from the final application? So you are a player in the whole system, but not to the end. How do you think about risk in that context?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the reason we are developing this software is still for the patient's benefit. So even though we are not directly speaking to the patient as our customer, we still need to consider the risks of our software and how that will affect the end user. Because the customers of ours, the IVD manufacturers who use our software, they are trusting that we have considered those risks already. So they really depend on us to ensure that our software already meets those requirements and they don't need to reimagine those risks.
So then for your risk management process, do you draw the boundary at the software or do you go all the way to the diagnostic application or the diagnostic system?
It's a bit of a mix. We can only draw the line on what we are able to control ourselves. So we can't imagine the risks of any of the downstream components that will go into the device, but we can understand the types of integrations that we're designing to meet. So if we know that we're going to integrate into a specific type of plugin or a specific type of analysis, then we definitely should consider the risks of what happens if that analysis can't be executed in the way that we hope.
Yeah, and I think the reason I'm curious about this, Megan, is because, even conventional, let's say even hardware, just hardware-based devices, the supply chain is pretty complex. And I have seen a lot of risk-related issues on the supplier side. And generally, they might think about their component or raw materials and draw the line there, but they don't have much visibility to how it's going to be integrated. But you're talking about software, so I'm kind of guessing that you have to really be very aware and knowledgeable about how it's going to be integrated in the system. And does it present some challenges to you in terms of the extent of knowledge that you have or the system in which it will be used, or you have some general ideas?
No, absolutely. That adds so much complexity. I think software, more than any other type of device, has integrations with other systems and other devices and a really complex network of dependencies and infrastructure that you need to consider. So it can become a very difficult thing to imagine when doing your risk management.
Perfect. All right. So looks like Phil and Bijan, you have joined us. Phil, you are first. Please unmute your mic and share what you have in mind. Phil, can you hear me? Okay, we'll give a moment. Okay.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you now. Phil, go ahead.
Sorry, unmute my mic. Common issue now. Thank you, Megan, for your comments. Actually, your last comment leads into my question perfectly. I have a little experience in IoT, and is your company looking? And you don't, if you can't say, of course, I understand. But are you looking into, or are you considering any kind of integrations with things like Google Home, Alexa, Siri, for people that have, their phones in their hands and might want to get notifications through this software a little bit easier?
As far as I know, we don't have any integrations planned with that currently, just because it doesn't fit with the scope of our current intended use. But I'm not usually the first person to know about those types of integrations. I usually find out after we've decided that now we need to evaluate the risks of the integration.
Mm-hmm. But it seems like, Phil, you are bringing an interesting point, because the future is going that way, right? Future is going to give information directly to the user or the patient in the hands of them, and how it's delivered to them is through these integrations. So yes, that's great. Phil, do you have any additional comments on that point?
No, I wasn't aware of the intended use. So if it's not intended, then that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Bijan, go ahead, please. Unmute your mic and share what you have in mind.
Hi, Megan. Thanks for your presentation. I have a couple of questions. First question is that, is your product already approved, or are you just working on it now?
We're currently approved as a component in our customers' submissions. So we don't have a submission of our own as of yet, but we are planning to have that in the future, in this coming year, actually.
Okay. And then the second question is about, how did you address the benefit risk analysis of your product?
That is definitely a consideration we have to have. The same as any other device, we have to make sure that the benefits that we're offering outweigh the risks. Do you have a more specific question around that ratio?
Yes, more specific is that the benefit is more clear. How did you address the risk, and how did you manage to compare and ensure that the benefits outweigh the risks?
I guess, do you have a specific example? I'm not sure what the question is really, other than we have that process in place.
I guess, Bijan, where you are going with this, I have a feeling that, benefit risk is sometimes tends to be vague and like there's no clear-cut guidance or direction on that, how to do it, how to actually measure benefit versus risks, and how to even compare the two. And that there's a lot of ambiguity around that. There are certainly guidance documents, Megan, and I wonder if you could probably talk a little bit about, in the context of FDA's guidance about benefit risk, if that's applicable to you. I know you don't have your own submission, but if you are thinking about that, I'm guessing now you'll have to think about how FDA will look at PMA or de novo submissions and evaluate benefit risk. Perhaps that's the way to think about this question.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So it's very similar to the challenge that's faced with designing an intended use that is accurate, where because we're a component of the ultimate IVD, we can't make claims in our intended use around the clinical applicability of our component. Same thing with the benefit to risk ratio. We can't make claims about the benefits in terms of the final device, because that's not part of our intended use. So the challenge of designing the benefit to risk ratio means that we have to consider, what benefits do we provide as simply the analysis component of that device.
Got you. And the key point here, based on my understanding of FDA's guidance, is that you have to be able to demonstrate that using valid scientific data. So if the software is used for analytical purposes only inside the lab environment, then I'm guessing, Megan, maybe you can you can add to that a little bit, you may have to demonstrate like to what accuracy you are showing analytical sensitivity or specificity, or how does it help with the final diagnosis. But you have to draw the box around your component and then be able to describe the benefits. But the key message here is that whatever you do, however you define it, you also have to find a way to prove that you have accomplished that benefit. And you have to prove with data that you have controlled the risks, right?
Correct.
Bijan, I know you have thought about this topic a lot also in the context of software. Would you like to add a little bit to this discussion, especially from a benefit risk point of view?
Yeah, I mean, this is a challenge in particular for software, and estimation of risk of software failure is a challenge because according to IEC 62304, there is no consensus for estimating the probability of occurrence of software failure. So they say set it to 1. So when you have a software-only product, set the probability of failure to 1, it creates a situation that how do you show that the benefits outweigh the risks? What I was interested in is Megan's product is purely software. Is that how did they approach it? And maybe we can learn some lessons from that. That was kind of where I was going.
Sure, I understand. I think that could be another topic that we can dig deeper into it. But guys, I know many of you in the audience have also a lot of experience and thoughts about software risk management. So maybe we can broaden the topic a little bit more if you are open to sharing your views and perspectives. As you know, in these sessions, our goal here is to engage in a broader conversation. So don't hold back. I invite you to share your thoughts, whatever you can share from your perspective. Software is a tough topic, as Bijan has mentioned, from a risk management point of view, benefit risk point of view. There is guidance available here and there, but there is no consensus on a structured approach to this. So if any one of you has worked in this area, has any insights to share, please don't hold back and come on board. It'll be a very nice conversation. So let's continue. We still have time. We have about 5-6 minutes or so today. And, Megan, I have also thought about benefit risk in quite a lot of detail. And as I mentioned before, there is no consensus about, a systematic approach to applying benefit risk to medical devices. Forget software is even more difficult. And as Bijan mentioned, the probability of software failure is generally considered to be 1. And that becomes a challenge for practitioners. And I know you are more in the regulatory space. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about your experience, maybe engaging with the FDA or other regulatory professionals. How are they thinking about? How do they generally think about benefit risk? And doesn't have to be software, but more of a general question. Can you share something about that?
No, I agree with you both deeply on this topic. And I think just in the same way that we feel that frustration because of the lack of clarity, we see that same lack of clarity with the regulators themselves. And so what happens is you might get very different feedback from the FDA about your benefit risk ratio or any other elements of your risk management file, depending on the reviewer that you have. Mm-hmm. And that can be very frustrating for manufacturers. And to bring this back to this LDT rule concept, imagine that we are all struggling as IVD manufacturing professionals or device manufacturing professionals who have worked in this risk management area for many, many years. Imagine LDT manufacturers who are brand new to these types of requirements and having to navigate this lack of clarity in a relatively short amount of time, and the risks that poses for their organization. It's quite a scary thing for them.
Yeah. So I would imagine, Megan, maybe you can add to this a little bit, that engaging with the FDA early through the QSUB process might be beneficial, because then they can get a little bit more targeted advice.
Of course, definitely. And I would also emphasize too, leaning on the people that are already in the device industry who have had more experience with navigating the FDA's questions and with navigating 14971, because these people would have had much more experience to be able to understand it deeply and to know what it means to actually implement these controls. Because as we all know on this call, there's a large difference between what's written in the QMSR and what the FDA actually expects to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Megan, on that point, are you aware of any, forums where such discussions are happening, maybe in your circles or regulatory circles or quality circles? Are you aware of any other, professional societies or forums where people are beginning to focus on these topics?
Yeah, I'm starting to see a lot more discussion. To be honest, at the moment, it's much more around the litigation and lobbying that's happening to try and slow or stop the rule from happening. But I do think the FDA is firm on their position on this. So I think even if those discussions around delaying the rule do happen, I believe it's only a matter of time until this is our new reality. And in terms of discussions that are happening around how to implement the rule, the FDA themselves have actually been pretty supportive by providing webinars and frequently asked questions and many other resources to try to educate the industry. I don't think it's sufficient just yet. There's still lots of questions out there, but I'm hoping that more of that will continue to come as this plan begins to be implemented.
Yeah. Bijan and Phil, I would ask the same questions to you guys too. Are you aware of any professional forums where we are beginning to focus on this specific topic of benefit risk? And are we learning anything new? My interest here is to basically broaden our network and connect with wherever these discussions are happening.
I'm not, Naveen, so I don't know. Phil, are you?
I have a colleague that works with me at MetaView that's in specifically the regulatory space, and he attends a conference called RAPS. I believe there was something in that.
Okay.
That was they were talking about.
Certainly, RAPS.
Yeah, RAPS is always a great resource, definitely.
Yeah. All right, guys. So with that, we are coming to the end of our planned 30 minutes. I'll give Megan just a couple of minutes to process her thoughts and share some key takeaway points. But in the meantime, I have a few announcements to share with you. Next week, we're going to have a very interesting conversation around software again, especially software as a medical device, starting from development all the way through maybe regulatory review and approval. What are some of the challenges and insights we can gain from that experience? So I'll be talking to my guest, David Keyes, and we will learn hopefully a lot about this topic and maybe, get some questions answered. So show up again. It's going to be at 11 o'clock Eastern on next Friday. You will see the announcement. Actually, the announcement has gone out on LinkedIn already. So take a look at that. Second thing is that this is a weekly event for those of you who are joining for the first time. So if you are interested in these conversations, just put it on your calendar at 11 a.m. Eastern. You can expect to engage in a very casual, informal conversation like this. Maybe make some new connections, guys. That's another intention we have, is to connect people in our industry with each other, have more of these conversations, recognize the problems we are facing collectively. And finally, I would say that if you miss these sessions, you will find a recording of these conversations on the Let's Talk Risk newsletter website. There's a link I have provided to you in the comments section on the events page. Go ahead and check it out and sign up for updates if you are interested. With that, Megan, please share a couple of comments that we can take away from today.
Absolutely. So just to summarize, for those of you listening who are impacted by the LDT rule, I would say that if you're planning to try to obtain approval or clearance of your test, that you please do not try to follow the plan that is actually laid out by the FDA. That is their plan for enforcement, but it should not be your implementation plan. The first two stages are manageable, but if you don't start preparing ahead, it will be a very difficult transition for you. And in general, those of you on the call that are not affected by the LDT rule, but maybe are affected by other regulatory changes, the same advice applies of not trying to white knuckle the change alone by yourself with only the guidance from the FDA. It's far better to reach out to someone who knows the ins and outs, connect with networks, connect with groups, and work together to be able to solve these problems and understand the regulatory change deeply. Because as we know, it's not always straightforward when it comes to the FDA.
Yeah, perfect. And Megan, to be honest, that's one of our major intention of these conversations, to again connect people with each other. So don't feel like you're alone. We have a big community. We have a lot of people with a lot of knowledge and experience. Many of you today in the audience actually have that. And I would love for all of us to connect with each other, reach out to each other and make new connections. Continue to talk about this, continue to share your perspective so all of us can learn. Finally, guys, I want to do a call out here. Don't hold back and contact me if you are interested in participating as a guest speaker in these conversations with me. I know without exception, all of you have something interesting to share. With that, Megan, Bijan, Phil, thanks again for this wonderful conversation today. I know, guys, we have a lot of unanswered questions, but again, keep in mind, the purpose of these conversations is not to give you cookie-cutter answers. The purpose is to acknowledge the gaps in our collective understanding and contribute to our collective knowledge. So I hope you guys are enjoying these sessions. Reach out to me anytime if you have any feedback for me. If you have a topic of interest, also let me know. And if you want to speak, again, let me know. Thanks again, all of you, and please have a good weekend. We will see you once again next week.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.